My name is Ken Levinson, the Executive Director of NAPHN, and I'm happy to introduce the two speakers for this session, Sahara James and Oliver Style, for Get Cool, Stay Cool. No other issue is so important today as overheating mitigation, the warming of the climate, and the result on our health, our resilience, our comfort and safety. And today, I'm really excited and wanted to introduce this talk because we're bringing together the idea of not just investment in better buildings, but investment in the context in the neighborhoods around those buildings, that both aspects contribute to the performance of being resilient, of being more sustainable. And we have to lift those levels of investment, particularly in those areas that have been underinvested in and suffer some of the worst repercussions of climate change. So today, we bring together these two ideas and hopefully have powerful solutions going forward in terms of mitigating overheating. Sahara James is the Senior Sustainability Consultant at Kinetic Communities Consulting, based in New York City. And Oliver Style is the Director of Praxis Resilient Buildings, based in Barcelona, Spain. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sahara James. I use she, her pronouns, and today I'll be talking to you all about the health and environmental and social implications of excessive or extreme heating, and I will be taking a very specific look at New York City. So just a little bit about myself before we start. I am a senior sustainability consultant with Kinetic Communities Consulting, or KC3 for short. KC3 is a New York MWBE certified consulting firm. We advocate and implement strategic energy equity market transformations for diverse New York communities. My role as senior sustainability consultant mainly comprises being campaign director for Electrify NYC, or ENYC for short. This is a state-funded effort to both increase energy efficiency and clean energy upgrades in small residential buildings and support the local clean energy workforce. And I am also a part-time student at Bard College's MBA in Sustainability program. So extreme heating is one of the many side effects of our current climate crisis. As many of you already know, climate change itself is not a new concept. Our Earth's climate has had several massive shifts throughout its history. However, the two things that are specifically different about the climate change that is happening now is one, that it is anthropogenically forced. 99% of climate scientists agree that climate change is happening today because of greenhouse gas emissions that are being emitted from our day-to-day. And two, that the rate of climate change now vastly exceeds anything that has been seen within the last 10,000 years. So we cannot underestimate the severity of the side effects of climate change that mankind will continue to face today. So various reputable sources seem to refer to extreme heat and excessive heat interchangeably. So just so you know, I'll probably be doing the same throughout this presentation. And after extrapolating verbiage from a few different government websites, we're going to work with the following definition for today. So we are going to define extreme heat as above average temperature and humidity over prolonged periods of time. So what's causing extreme heating? Well, there is a very strong positive correlation between average surface temperature and global atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So it shows here that greenhouse gas emissions seem to be pushing extreme heating. One of the easiest ways to observe how frequently excessive heat is affecting us is we can look at the frequency of heat waves and the length of heat wave seasons throughout the year. So we take a look at this graph and we see on the left that the average number of heat waves has increased throughout the majority of the US ever since the 60s. And according to the right, the heat wave season itself on average has gotten 2 to 3 weeks longer in many cities in the US as well. There's also, as you may also know, an intense heat wave sweeping through northern India right now with record temperatures of 49.2 degrees Celsius or 120.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Average maximum temperatures for the month were the highest they've been in 122 years. So there are many side effects of this heat wave in India, and a few of them here. One was major anticyclones developing in the western parts of India. So these are areas of high atmospheric pressure where the air sinks, which leads to hot, dry weather over parts of western India. Um, the extreme heat there is also negatively impacting their wheat harvest. And this development could potentially have global consequences, considering that we're already experiencing serious supply chain issues because of the war in Ukraine and residually through from the COVID-19 pandemic. The heat in India has also triggered an increase in power demand, leading to outages in many states and fears of a coal shortage. And there is also the increased risk of fires due to temperatures rising. So we know that extreme heat is bad on its own, but there are factors that can exacerbate its effects. So, for example, old and poorly maintained buildings can exacerbate this. These buildings are more likely to have old cooling systems and poor ventilation, either increasing operating costs or decreasing the comfort level for the occupants. This chart shows how much of gross potential rent prices are comprised of operating costs depending on the age of a building. So it is essentially showing that the older a building is, the higher proportion of its rent is taken up by its operating costs. So older buildings tend to have higher operating costs. Their old infrastructure also exacerbates excessive heating and climate change in general, considering these buildings tend to use fossil fuels for heating and cooling. So this feedback loop shows how the increased greenhouse gas emissions from these old buildings exacerbate the effects of excessive heating, thus increasing summer energy demand for old buildings, thus increasing greenhouse gas emissions, and the positive feedback loop continues. So, in continuing to think about these exacerbating factors, we also want to talk about the urban heat island effect. This effect is specific to cities, and it is when city dwellers experience higher temperatures in the summertime compared to nearby rural areas due to the large area of heat absorbent paved surfaces. Such as I'm sorry, and also the lack of green space. So it's a combination of pavement and green space, and sometimes it's just called heat islands. So this also creates a feedback loop. This shows how the increased greenhouse gas emissions from these old buildings, again, exacerbate the effects of excessive heating, thus increasing summer energy demand for old buildings, thus increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, the feedback loop continues. So these exacerbating factors I just mentioned are especially an issue in the city that I know and love, the Big Apple, and it's specifically because of our unique infrastructure. New York City is notorious for old buildings, with the median age of a surviving residential building being about 90 years old. Additionally, we have high energy demand overall, but very excessive energy demand in the summer. On average, New York City uses 8,000 megawatts of power. And in the summer, with the increase with turning on cooling systems, we go up to as much as 11,500 megawatts of energy demand in the summer. This demand puts a lot of stress on our infrastructure, and our blackout frequency proves it. According to Pew's data, from 2000 to 2005, the country only averaged about 43 large scale outages a year. And that is in comparison to post 2010, when we had an average of 100 major outages a year. And this chart is also showing how blackout frequency and also the amount of people who are being affected by these blackouts has also been increased in the last few years. So now let's talk about how extreme heat affects us personally, so particularly our health. To help frame our understanding of why heat has such serious effects on the body, we can take a look at this chart from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, showing how higher temperatures and higher relative humidity levels increase the heat index, or the real feel, which is the real feel of the temperature to a person. Essentially, the hotter and the more humid it is, the higher, the more risk there is for someone who is outside for many periods of, or a long period of time, or in an unair conditioned space, to experience heat illnesses. So, how serious are these heat illnesses? Well, many of you may know that they absolutely can be deadly. So, let's start with some of the less critical, or earlier signs of heat illness. So we have heat rash and heat cramps, and both of these can be addressed without medical attention. Heat cramps, the symptoms include having sweaty during exercise, muscles pain or spasms, and red clusters that appear on the skin. On the more critical side of heat disorders, we have heat exhaustion and heat strokes. Heat exhaustion symptoms include heavy sweating, cold, clammy skin, muscle cramps, etc. And heat stroke symptoms can include hot and dry skin, confusion, hallucination and disorientation, loss of consciousness or being unresponsive, etc. In both instances, acting quickly to cool a person down and or get emergency assistance is absolutely critical. These are really the medical concerns we want to avoid during prolonged heat waves, as these are completely avoidable deaths. And it's also important to keep in mind that these illnesses are most dangerous to those among us who are already the most medically vulnerable. So with that, we're going to get into the social implications of extreme heat. So everyone does not have equal exposure or risk of experiencing heat illnesses. People are more likely to die from heat if they, of course, do not have or use air conditioning, and have chronic medical conditions such as heart, lung, or kidney disease, or obesity, have serious mental health, cognitive, or developmental conditions such as dementia or schizophrenia, take medicines that make it difficult for the body to cool down, misuse drugs or alcohol, and lastly, have limited mobility or are unable to leave their home. According to the New York City Heat Vulnerability Index, adults age 60 and older are more likely to have some combination of these risk factors. And additionally, Black New Yorkers are also at higher risk of dying from these, due in part to racist systems and policies that impact their health and available resources. Heat illnesses are also more likely to be experienced among infants and children. Babies and children up to 4 years old are more sensitive to heat, so caregivers need to make sure that infants and children stay cool and have enough water to drink. Make sure to watch out for signs for heat illnesses, and never leave children in hot places, especially cars, by themselves. Pregnant people are also more sensitive to heat, and increase in body temperature may bring on labor, preterm birth, or lower birth rates. Those who are pregnant should stay in a cool place, drink fluids, and take it easy when it is hot outside. And lastly, workers, people who are in unair conditioned indoor or outdoor spaces are at risk of experiencing heat stress. Workers at risk of heat stress include outdoor workers and workers in hot environments such as firefighters, cooks, farmers, construction workers, miners, boiler room and factory workers, and others. So water, rest, and keeping cool can help workers stay safe when it is extremely hot outside, and prevent the risk of experiencing heat illness. So this chart is showing how energy burden varies across New York City. Energy burden is when a family pays more than 6% of their income on energy bills. When a family is paying more than 6% of their income on these bills, they are considered energy cost burdened. As you can probably guess, being lower income increases energy burden rates for people. This chart is actually specifically showing that there are approximately 600,000 New York City families, that's 1.5 million people, by the way, that are energy cost burdened. So There are also, of course, environmental implications to extreme heat. So I'm just going to talk through a few of those. High temperatures can be damaging to agriculture as plant growth is negatively impacted by high daytime temperatures. Heat waves also increase the chances of livestock experiencing heat stress, especially when nighttime temperatures remain high and animals are unable to cool off. Heat stressed cattle can experience declines in milk production, slower growth, and reduced consumption rates. Heat waves can exacerbate droughts and wildfires, which can lead to negative impacts on the agricultural sector. For example, wildfires in California have burned agricultural land and are raising the cost of insurance for farms and wineries. The environmental and social consequences of extreme heat come to a head when we look at hospitalization rates for asthma. So, for context, as described before, excessive heat and heat island raise electricity demand in the summer, further increasing GHG emissions in our city, negatively impacting our air quality. People who live in poor neighborhoods suffer disproportionately from health issues related to poor air quality. As you can see by the deep red on this chart, high hospitalization rates for asthma are concentrated in the Bronx. The Bronx has the highest poverty levels in New York City, and 90% of the Bronx's population is either Black or Hispanic and or Latino. This is what we are talking about when we talk about environmental racism. And I want to sum up what I've just covered with this really great quote from We Act, a nonprofit organization in New York City. In part due to patterns of racial discrimination and segregation, concentrated poverty, and public and private divestment, populations in New York City that are already vulnerable to poor health outcomes are also overburdened with higher death and illness rates from extreme heat. Exposure to high temperature varies considerably according to land surfaces within a city, and in New York City, people of color often live in areas characterized by little canopied vegetation and abundant heat retaining surfaces like dark pavements, roofs, and building materials. So now that we have a clear understanding of how extreme heat threatens our livelihoods, let's take a look into some of the solutions that various stakeholders have taken on to dampen the effects and the intensity of extreme heat. And I will say that these solutions are specific to New York City. So, of course, I have to start off with some bias. So, we have to talk about Passive House. So, Passive House, as you know, focuses on occupant comfort rather than energy efficiency, resulting in way less heat gain and heat loss. This results in high quality, comfortable, and healthy homes that cost dramatically less to operate and protect people from utility price shocks like we recently saw with Kinetic customers in New York. So Passive House does this using five main principles. So we have first climate specific insulation levels. This consists of right size continuous insulation throughout a building. Thermal bridge free connections. So thermal bridges are where heat essentially escapes out of a building. So we want minimal thermal bridges on a building. Air tightness. We want an airtight enclosure to control air quality. High performance windows and doors with solar protection to allow passive solar heat gain. And lastly, high efficiency heat recovery ventilation. So when we think about localizing this in New York City, I know the first question for me was how feasible is this, right? Because New York City has a very specific and unique infrastructure. Well, we know what's feasible with the Hannah Corona Senior Residence in Queens, New York. This is an 8-story, 68-unit passive house building to house very low income and formerly homeless seniors with a preschool on the first floor, and it was completed in 2018. As the first new senior affordable building in Queens in 30 years, Think Architecture created a more vibrant and intergenerational community by creating this shared space. As we know, for passive house design to achieve its full potential for impact, it must be the framework used from the very beginning, stages of new building development. So when done properly, one can expect a 3 to 5% increase in project cost for passive house design new buildings. But it is also important to remember that pH design can lead to a 75% reduction in equipment sizing and a 90% reduction in usage, which would make all electric heating and cooling way more feasible with a smaller heating and cooling load. So that 11,500 megawatts in the summer in New York City that I mentioned earlier could really be cut down significantly if we had way more passive house buildings in New York City. However, of course, realistically speaking, New York City cannot scorch the earth and start anew with a completely new building portfolio. So energy EnerFit, standards can also be used for flexible pathways to phasing of passive house performance standards for existing buildings. So let's take a look at some of the policy solutions that exist in New York City. We have the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019. This law commits New York City to 100% zero emission electricity by 2040 and a reduction of at least 85% below 1990 level GHG emissions by 2050. The CLCPA represents one of the most aggressive clean energy and climate agendas in the country. Very proud to be here for that. And this is comprised of local laws 92, 94, 96, and 97, which incentivizes the development of solar and green roofs, requires publicly visible building energy efficiency gradings, developing a financing program to fund qualifying energy efficiency and renewable energy projects, and GHG emission reduction standards. Let's take a look at some economic solutions that exist in New York City. So we have the Green Infrastructure Grant, the NYC Green Infrastructure Grant, and this is a Department of Environmental Protection funded tax incentive for green infrastructure projects in New York City. There is also the Property Tax Abatement Amendment, which expands the definition of a green roof and slightly increases the value of the tax abatement. So the amendment essentially increases the accessibility and increases the incentive, which is exactly the combination that we want. And to talk about some cross sector collaboration examples that exist, as I mentioned earlier, I'm campaign director for Electrify NYC. This is essentially NYSERDA's Staten Island and Queens clean heating and cooling campaign. So NYSERDA essentially has this statewide initiative where they are increasing adoption of clean heating and cooling technology and pushing the clean energy workforce. There's also the New York State Urban Forestry Program, which awarded over $2 million to communities and organizations across New York by the Department of Environmental Conservation to support the health of urban and community forests and to increase the sustainability of forestry programs. So this reimbursement grant focuses on partnerships, volunteers, community groups, professionals, and outreach and education because these are the strong components of a sustainable community. And eligible projects include categories like tree inventories, management plans, education, programming, etc. There's also Cool at New York City. This is an example of identifying vulnerable populations and creating heat preparedness plans with all residents considered. Columbia University developed the New York City Heat Vulnerability Index, and this data was used to direct new cooling elements such as misting stations, spray showers, drinking fountains, and tree cover to places that need them the most. There's also the New York City Accelerator. This is a city-funded initiative to assist large residential buildings with complying with Local Law 97, like I mentioned earlier. And lastly, we have launching a climate risk training for home health aides. This is something that New York City did back in 2017. They partnered with home care agencies to promote heat health messages to New Yorkers and engage home health aides to take care of their patients during heat waves. So, when we think about solutions to extreme heat or excessive heating, we want to think about these things. So, solutions have to be equitable and inclusive. So, they must include those among us who are most at risk. They must also be based on community outreach and input. The community of people that will be affected by a solution need to be at the table when creating said solution. This takes deep and intentional community engagement. It also has to be customized for geography. So, like I mentioned earlier, New York City has a few infrastructure things to consider when we think about how do we deal with extreme heat. So, solutions to extreme heat have to fit your city depending on climate, size, population, infrastructure, policy, etc. Solutions, of course, also have to be sustainable. So solutions have to be long lasting for future generations. And lastly, they have to include cross sector collaboration. The examples that I mentioned earlier, the ones that even weren't listed under cross sector collaboration, still do involve cross sector collaboration. You have to involve government agencies, utilities, building contractors, community engagement organizations, educational programs, etc., to create real, comprehensive, and effective solutions to extreme heat. So, with that, I thank you all for your time and your attention, and I look forward to speaking with all of you throughout the rest of the Passive House Network 2022 conference. Enjoy the rest of your day.
I wanted to share with you a presentation called Keep Cool and Carry On, which basically brings together lessons learned from about 10 to 12 years of trying to keep passive houses cool in mainly sort of Mediterranean coastal climates, which is the area where we work in the northeast of Spain, in Catalonia, Barcelona area. So a lot of the solutions will obviously be more specific to the kind of technologies and construction practices that are here and in Europe. But I think and I hope that they will be useful for you working across in the US in different areas, and hopefully it can be useful for your work and projects. So where were we? Well, 2,000 years ago, in terms of global temperatures, we were here where you can see at the start of the graph, and then we invented the steam engine, and as we know, things started getting out of hand, and we're dealing with a really significant and rapid increase in temperatures and everything, all the associated environmental problems. So, of course, doomsday headlines abound. Record-shattering heat waves are being reported everywhere. Peak temperatures of records are being broken. Maximum temperature records being beaten across the US, people dying in heat waves, which is also a tragic and major problem, of which this is quite a revealing and shocking graph. This just shows the mortality rate in France during the 2003 heat wave compared with the first wave of COVID in 2020. So what we could see is that the peak mortality rate was actually higher in the heat wave than it was in the first wave of COVID. Obviously, the absolute numbers are quite different. But what this shows us is heat waves are deadly, literally, and they're going to be more and more common and more frequent. So we really, really need to get on top of this and get our buildings ready and equipped for dealing with intense heat, and do that in such a way that they use a minimum amount of energy, and we use the minimum amount of kit or equipment with which to do that. So again, we have all these worrying news of maximum temperatures here in the Arctic, for example, in 2021, ice sheet breaking up, maximum temperatures of 31 degrees, 51.4 degrees in Mexicali in Mexico last June, and 128 degrees Fahrenheit maximum temperatures in the aptly named Furnace Creek in Death Valley last June too. So these are really, really extreme temperature increases, combined with a geopolitical situation in which energy prices are rocketing, electricity specifically. So here we can see the increase in electricity prices across the US 2020 to 2021. So this is really really quite critical, because of course active cooling, air conditioning uses electricity, and that means that we're going to be, or could increasingly be, in a situation where people can only keep cool if they can afford to do that. So we have a kind of summer or cooling energy poverty sort of scenario in front of us. So we really need to think about that, because the price of energy, the price of electricity is only going to increase as we move further and further into the energy transition, in which we need to move away from fossil fuel-based systems to renewable energy systems. So every kilowatt hour that we can save is really crucial. And how can we do that? Well, there's solutions, of course, like there are to many of these problems. And I just want to present a few of them, and I hope that they'll be useful to you. So if we look a bit at world climate zones, I mean, in the US, you have really incredible range of climates that you have to deal with, you know, from hot and humid to hot and dry to cool temperate to everything in between. So a really a massive range of climates. This is a climate map classification according to the Passive House Institute, you know, and I think the question is, or one of the questions is going to be, as we move forwards, are we going to need active cooling in kind of warm temperate climates? I think that's probably almost certainly the answer will be yes. And even in cool temperate climates, I mean, I was talking to colleagues in Canada the other day who were saying we expect that active cooling will be needed in most of our buildings within about 10 years time. This is really surprising. So, but it reflects the situation. So, you know, we're going to be needing active cooling. Now, of course, the whole focus of Passive House is how to optimize passive systems so that you don't need active systems and technology. That's, of course, always the objective. We must do that even if we're going to put air conditioning in, even if we're going to use active systems. And I want to run through some of those strategies. So, you know, we're going to be increasingly needing to consider some kind of cooling or active cooling system in many climates, which previously wasn't the case. So I'm just going to run through a few passive cooling tips before we move on to the active systems. One is just paying attention to local climate. So have a look in your project at the local climate conditions. You know, the climate files that you may be using in your PHPP calculation or whatever energy model you may be using will obviously be based on historical data from a given Met station, but have a look at the conditions where you are, because if you move inland and upwards, particularly from coastal areas, if that's the case, conditions can change quite rapidly. So it's always good to have a look at what's happening in your local climate, and if you can get data from a local Met station, have a look at that, compare it to what you're using in your calculations, and if need be, make adjustments. Passive cooling tip number 2. Well, this is you know, traditional Mediterranean strategy that's been used also all over the world. It's just helping keeping buildings cool by painting them with light colors. No? They just reflect more solar radiation, less is absorbed, and it helps keep buildings cool, particularly on roofs. Important to be careful with cool roofs in hot, dry climates, because you can actually end up cooling the roof so much in the nighttime that it possibly could cause condensation problems. But cool colors are an important and useful strategy in warm climates. You know, reflect more sun and less transmission heat gains into the building. Passive cooling tip number 3, ground coupling. Now, this is basically putting not very much thermal insulation on the floor slabs. You know, obviously this would be more significant in low-rise buildings, residential, smaller buildings where they have more of their envelope in the contact with the ground. But the idea is to use the ground as a heat sink. You know, so you just dissipate heat to the ground in the summer. Now, here we can see on that graph an example of the ground temperatures below the floor slab of a small passive house. And we can see that from June to September, the ground temperatures are below what the indoor air temperature would be, you know, ranging from 15 to 19 degrees. So if we put a bit less insulation on the ground floor slabs, then we can dissipate heat in the summer. Also important to make sure we don't put too little that it causes comfort problems in the winter. So, you know, question of finding a balance. But this can be a useful strategy in very warm climates. If we get to very hot climates, the ground isn't especially cool, so it doesn't even work there. Important to look at your climate file, and if you're using the PHPP, one of the many great things about the tool is that you have that information there in the climate files, you know, about what the ground temperature is. Passive cooling tip number 4, roof insulation. You know, this is fairly straightforward and obvious, but you know, we need good thermal insulation on the roofs, which are being pounded by the sun in the summer, where there's obviously a lot of heat trying to get in. Radiant barriers can also be useful to reflect that radiant heat and keep buildings cool. So, you know, a good bit of thermal insulation on the roof is a really key strategy. Passive cooling tip number 5, natural night ventilation and thermal inertia. So here, this is quite climate specific because we need to, it will only work really in areas where your nighttime temperatures are sufficiently low. But the strategy is quite simple. You know, you just ventilate naturally at nighttime, you extract the heat that's been accumulated in the mass, in the thermal mass of the building, preparing it for the next day and cooling it. So we can also use the PHPP tool. You can see the screenshot on the left there, which has natural ventilation auxiliary calculations. So you can test and see what happens if you have openings in different sides of the building, different heights, to get simple cross and stack ventilation. A really good strategy. Again, if the climate's suitable for getting heat out of your building at night. And cooling it passively. Of course, you've got to take into account insects, rain, security, and all these things. But natural night ventilation combined with thermal inertia can be a really useful strategy. Cooling tip number 6, ceiling fans. These are traditional solution which just moves air. Of course, it doesn't cool you actively, but it helps you, improves your thermal comfort because as air moves across over our body, we dissipate more heat in the summer. So ceiling fans are good, use relatively little energy and can just keep air moving. And it might mean that the air conditioning is put on for a few less hours every day if we do have those working. So ceiling fans also useful. Tip number 7, internal gain. So in a passive house, we've got a really good thermal envelope. We've got a really good skin of the building, which is well insulated, great windows, hardly any air leaks. Logically, any heat that's in there will therefore stay there longer. So if it can't be dissipated, it can be a problem in the summer. So anything that generates heat, appliances, and especially domestic hot water systems, we need to look at. Make sure appliances are efficient, make sure lighting is efficient, and be really careful with domestic hot water systems, particularly the recirculation loops, if you do have them. These can be they become a big radiator in a building in the summer, because there's water just circulating around a pipe at 55, 60 degrees, and that can really cause overheating problems. As you can see on this graph on the right, that the greatest losses from the hot water system, which are basically the heat gains to the building, is from recirculation in this case. So you need to design compact systems, keep pipe runs short, insulate them well, and try and locate all of that equipment outside of the thermal envelope if possible. Passive tip number 8, probably the most important, opening, design, and shading devices, blinds and solar protection, particularly to east and westerly orientations if we're in the northern hemisphere, because they're the ones, as you can see in this graph, which get more sun in the summer months. There's more solar radiation to an east and west facade than there is to the south from June to September, so because the sun's lower in the sky in the morning and in the afternoon. So we need to really watch those windows, trying to reduce window size to the east and west, and the north, of course, and keeping them more to the south for solar gain in the winter, and they're much easier to shade in the summer. Of course, external mobile shading devices are always going to be the most effective. If we're looking at combining them with fixed shading devices, then it's important to look at horizontal or vertical or lateral shading systems and how they perform in different orientations. And we can use Design pH SketchUp plugin for some simple shading analysis or other tools. So avoiding the temptation of having massive amounts of glass is quite key, and making sure that openings are well protected with shading devices is really one of the most important things. So if we're looking at passive cooling, what do we need to really look out for in the design phase? Well, if we're designing a passive house high performance building and we're using the PHPP, the Passive House Planning Package tool, and we're certifying the building, then there's a requirement that the overheating frequency must be below 10%. But we really shouldn't be aiming for that at a design stage. We should be aiming for 5%, ideally 2%. That's the percentage of hours in which the internal air temperature is above 25 degrees. So 10% of the hours of the year is 876 hours. And that's a lot of time in which the indoor temperature can be not just 26 degrees, but it could be 29, it could be 30, it could be 32, so don't just look at an Excel spreadsheet and think, okay, that's great, it complies. Think about the reality and keep, aim for a much lower overheating frequency. And also think about what people are going to do. Is it realistic to expect everybody to have their windows open all night and their blinds open and all their internal doors open? Because that may be what you're calculating when you're assuming a natural ventilation rate. Is that realistic in anywhere? But is it realistic, for example, in an inner city area where there's noise from the street, or is it realistic in a rural area where there's insects and so on? So think about your assumptions about what people are going to do in the building before you make calculations and assume assume large air change rates at night. And if you're working on tall or large buildings or in urban heat islands or in urban areas which are going to suffer from urban heat island effect, good to look at zone by zone overheating, and if need be, combine that with a dynamic simulation or multi-zone tool. There's also a climate tool which you can use with the PHPP, which looks at future climate scenarios and it adjusts the summer temperatures. So you can stress test your design and see how it might perform underneath, under heat wave conditions. So anyway, those are a few recommendations if you're just going to be working with passive cooling, and even if you're not, but just particularly if you're not going to rely on any active cooling, really important to look at question these things so that you don't get any phone calls from your clients after or in the middle of the first summer. Passive cooling, when won't it work? Well, under certain climate conditions, you can optimize everything passively up, as much as you can, but it's going to be very difficult to maintain comfort. Now here you can see an example of Barcelona in the heat wave. We had a heat wave in 2015. So the temperatures on the left and the absolute humidity on the right-hand graph. We don't have massively high temperatures because the sea modulates temperatures, but there's a huge amount of humidity. So it doesn't matter how much you ventilate at night, there's going to be temperatures are still going to be high. And in this kind of warm, humid climate, you're just going to have a lot of humidity. So equally, there may be, warm, dry climates in which the climate conditions don't let you make the most of passive cooling solutions. Here you can see an example of Furnace Creek at Death Valley, where minimum temperatures at night were 41 degrees for this night for the 10th of July 2021. So you're not going to get much night ventilation cooling power from 41 degrees minimum temperature. So there will be climates and situations of buildings in which passive cooling alone won't work. Does it work? Well, of course, it does. And there's lots of proof of it in monitored buildings. Here is a very small passive house. In fact, one of the first projects that we worked on near Barcelona, and this is passively cooled. And here we've got temperature and relative humidity data for the occupied hours in blue and the unoccupied hours in the red crosses. So most of the time we're in the inner comfort range, below 26 degrees and below 70% relative humidity. So passive cooling, of course, can work. It also depends on active users. People need to be aware of what they need to do in a building and stop the sun getting in and so on. So that's a kind of summary of some of the passive cooling strategies that we can use in buildings that don't use energy or use very little energy. So those, like I say, really important to try and implement them, even if we need active cooling. So now moving on to active cooling systems. What I've done here is just compared 6 different systems which we've designed, installed, and monitored over the last few years. These are mainly for single family homes, but they could be used in other, multi-residential and different kinds of buildings. But I've just done a table here which looks at 6 different criteria, and with a simple point scoring system, looks at them. So one of the criteria is a design. Let's have the simplicity or complexity of designing a system like this, the simplicity or complexity of installing or commissioning a system, its cost, efficiency, comfort, and peak load capacity. How able are these systems to deal with heat wave conditions? So we're looking at 6 different systems. The first 2 are radiant cooling systems. One is underfloor and the other is ceiling. Okay. The third system, I'm going to run through these all in a bit more detail, but the third system are just low temperature radiators. So these are basically floor mounted fan coil units, right? This is convective and radiant cooling with water distribution. System 4 is the kind of passive solution, classic passive solution of just putting a heating and cooling battery on the supply air of the ventilation system. So it's a really elegant solution in many ways, but we'll see what some of the pitfalls might be with that. And then 5 and 6 are basically a conventional air conditioning systems, fan coils using water distribution, and split systems, direct expansion or systems using refrigerant distribution. So both of those just involve recirculating indoor air, cooling that and dehumidifying. So we could see a little bit about what the complexities, cost, efficiency, comfort, and ability to deal with peak loads are of all of those different systems, of which 5 and 6 are the ones that are best able to deal with heat wave conditions. Let's just run through a few of them and see the monitored data. Okay, in system 6, what active cooling technology are we talking about? Well, it's a vapor compression circuit. Circulation of a refrigerant through a compressor and expansion valve, condenser and evaporator, which basically takes heat from inside the building and deposits it to the air outside. So this is, conventional air conditioning technology, which I'm sure you all know very well. So systems 1 to 5 use that same technology, but they incorporate a secondary water circuit. So heat is transferred from the inside of the building to a water circuit. That's then passed through a heat exchanger in which the heat is passed from water to refrigerant, and then that heat is deposited outside through the outdoor condenser. So this is basically the technologies that we're going to be looking at. In each case, we have monitored data which looks at air temperature and relative humidity and compares it with the optimum comfort range that we want for high performance passive house building. This is the comfort range that we're going to be looking for and calculating for in the PHPP tool. So 22 degrees minimum temperature in the summer up to 25. And the monitored data obviously shows air temperature, not operative temperature, because operative temperature, which includes the mean radiant temperature, is quite difficult and expensive to measure. But when we're calculating the PHPP and other tools, obviously, we're almost always going to be using operative temperature. That's the comfort temperature. It's a combination of air and the mean radiant temperature of all of the surfaces. So what we also look for, and we have this limitation in a passive house building, is the absolute humidity can't exceed 12 grams per kilo, excuse me, for more than 10% of the hours of the year. Okay, that's what we can see here in the passive on the PHPP results page. If as soon as we activate active cooling, we have to keep this humidity below 12 grams per kilo, below that 10%. So system 1, what did we do here? Well, what we used here was we put a recirculation loop on the ventilation system, which took air from a corridor, from a common space, not a bedroom and not a wet room, a bathroom or anything, just a common space, recirculated that with an additional fan and a non-return valve, and recirculated it through a dehumidifier. Okay, so that recirculated indoor air, cooling it and dehumidifies. at the same time, we're introducing outdoor air, which is obviously essential for air quality. But keeping the outdoor air supply to a minimum and recirculating a larger amount to basically give the system more power. Obviously, one of the great things about passive houses is these are 100% outdoor air systems. So that's why we have such good air quality rather than recirculating. We're not talking about not doing that. We're just recirculating a certain amount of the indoor air so that we don't have to then dehumidify and cool air coming from the outside, even if it has gone through a heat exchanger, because that doesn't make much sense. Okay, so what we did here was basically that: incorporate a recirculation loop for cooling and dehumidification, and then we use the underfloor heating system as a cooling system. So underfloor heating systems, of course, really comfortable. They're silent. They're very efficient when you work them with a heat pump, particularly. It is true that if you use them in a passive house, it's kind of overkill because everything is already so well insulated and at such a decent temperature that you don't really need an underfloor heating system. But you could put them in, and there's clients and people obviously who want them, and you can use it for cooling. This is what we did here. Pros and cons. Well, water supply temperature, you need to limit it. You can't really drop that temperature too low, mainly for comfort reasons. Walking on a floor that's below 19 degrees centigrade is uncomfortable. People will be barefoot in the summer or wearing light footwear. And of course, the other issue is the dew point. So, if you drop the temperature too low and you haven't dehumidified enough, you can get condensation. So maximum cooling power, the maximum amount of heat you can get out of a floor in those conditions is not very much. It's about 30 watts per square meter. It's obviously best suited for tiled or ceramic floors, best to avoid timber parquet for obvious reasons. Good to use, important to use plastic manifolds to avoid condensation, where you have your collector boxes and so on. And we would also recommend sort of low inertia underfloor heating systems like you can see in the image there, where there's a decoupling mat, which means that you only have to put a very thin mortar layer on top of the heating coils, pipes, without having any danger of the floor breaking up. And that means that the system is much more rapid to respond, which is also useful in a passive house because sometimes you just need a little bit of cooling at some point, or a little bit of cooling, a little bit of heating, and not have a really big high inertia underfloor heating system. So we installed this system in a single family home, in a terraced home, and here you can see the monitored results for a month, not very long, but it was a month in the summer 2019, and here you can see air temperature and relative humidity. So the humidity is really well controlled, actually, largely around 60%. That was the limit that we have of 12 grams per kilo at 25 degrees. Some temperatures that move outside the extended comfort range. It's possible that that's when occupants weren't actually there, but basically good comfort. Users are really happy with it. And energy use is really good and it's efficient. But these are complex systems to design. They're complex systems to commission. They require humidity and temperature sensors and a control system which works. Otherwise, you're going to end up with people sliding all over the floor and condensation everywhere, and that's going to be a problem. So these systems can work really well, but they're also more costly, more difficult to commission and maintain. And you also have to think, if people are going to have everything open in the summertime, there's going to be lots of humidity getting in. Okay, so they might not work. There may be a humidity problem. System number 2, we did basically the same solution with the dehumidification and the ventilation system, but here we used ceiling panels, radiant ceiling panels, which just have 8 mil water pipes, and we're running cool water through them. So because we don't have the comfort issue that we have with the floor, we could run the water temperature a bit lower, so around 15 degrees, which means we can get about 44 watts per meter squared cooling out of it, the heat out of a ceiling. Of course, you need to think about lighting fixtures in design phase, and locate manifolds at ceiling height to get air out of the circuits when you do the commissioning. So we installed here. You can see some images of the recirculation fan, the dehumidifier, and the radiant ceiling panels. The insulated pipes ducts are the ones that are carrying dehumidified cool air to the different areas. And now you can see a quick thermographic image underneath. So we installed the system in a small single family home that you can see here. We really didn't have very many days of monitoring, but here you can see some of the data, which just shows really good comfort. So these systems can work well, but what we have found is like I said before, that they can be more costly, more difficult to commission, maintain, and they aren't always very good at dealing with heat wave conditions. They don't have that extra bit of power that you might need when things get really, really, really hot. So system number 3, these are the floor mounted low temperature radiators. This is an installation we did in a single family home, putting 7 different underfloor radiators on the ground and first floor. So here we can supply water at much lower temperature, 7 degrees if need be. The maximum cooling power for a 180 centimeter long underfloor radiator like this is going to be about 2 kilowatts. So not a huge amount of cooling power, and it's quite localized, the amount of air that they can circulate. Okay, but here we can see, you know, what the technology basically is. It's a fan assisted radiator, floor mounted fan coil. So these have been installed in the house. This is a not coastal area. This is slightly inland and up, so not too much humidity. And here we can see monitored data for a month in 2019. So this is in the dining room, sitting room area. So really good dehumidification, and temperatures are basically within the inner comfort range. Clients are very happy with these radiators. So interesting solution. Like I say, I don't think they're very well suited. They're not very well suited to humid climates because they don't have too much dehumidification power. But in inland or more continental areas, they can be, I think, a good solution for cooling. System number 4. Okay, this is the cooling coil on the supply air of the ventilation system. So again, what we did with this was to give the system more power. We incorporated a recirculation loop. And that was all that the house had. 180 square meters passive house that we're talking about here. Let's just look at some of the numbers and what we're talking about. So we can supply water to this battery at around 13 degrees. Lower than this, we can start to get lots of condensation problems on the casing, depending on where we are. But what's the cooling power that we can get out of a system like this? Well, the calculation is quite simple. What you can see here, you know, it's the flow rate by 0.33 watt hours per meter cube per Kelvin multiplied by the temperature difference. So if we're supplying air at 15 degrees with a system and the indoor air temperature is 25, and we need 500 cubic meters of per hour of air, we're going to be able to supply 1.65 kilowatts of cooling power. So for 180 square meter passive house, that's only 9 watts per square meter of cooling power, which is generally not enough even for a passive house. Again, that depends. If we're in multi-residential compact apartment buildings where duct runs are short, you know, the system can work quite well and keep comfort. But, you know, if we've got long duct runs and different areas of the building which have quite different, you know, heat gains and losses, then we can be left short. And this is what we can see a bit in the monitored data here. This was during a month in the summer a few years ago. You know, temperatures, a lot of temperatures well out of the extended comfort range. No complaints from the clients because they're not particularly worried about overheating, strangely enough. But I think, you know, our conclusion is that these systems, you need to be quite careful because they don't have enough power and they're not very able to deal with heat wave conditions at all. You know, you just have a one cooling coil on the ventilation supply air, and these are low flow rates, so not a huge amount of power. They can also be combined very well with other conventional systems, you know, fan coils and splits. But on their own, important to look at whether they can deal with summer conditions. System 5, we don't have any monitored data, but it's the same as system 6 in many ways. But this is system 6. We're just talking direct expansion, ducted split units, with refrigerant distribution. So this is conventional air conditioning. We can get lower temperatures with the refrigerant than we can generally with water distribution. So that often means that we get better dehumidification. So these might be better suited to hot and humid climates. We can get more water out of the air. Maximum cooling power will depend on the model, make, manufacturer, and so on. But in this example, with the 6 kilowatt unit, you can see in the image, can modulate down to 0.9 or 1 kilowatt, but it can give you crank up to 6 kilowatts. So that's quite good because in passive houses, most of the time, you don't need that much cooling power. That's the great thing. So you can run these at very low flow rates. That means they're more silent, they're more efficient. It's not uncomfortable. You don't have, really cool air being blown all over you. And then if need be, you've got the power there to power them up and deal with really intense heat wave conditions, or what might happen when lots of people come around for lunch, or you put the oven on and make a pizza, or whatever it might be. So here you can see an example. This is a 3.5 kilowatt split unit installed on the ground floor, just one unit for in this home. And here you can see some of the monitored data. The monitored data doesn't really tell the whole story. Most of those hours in the extended comfort range is when people were out. And here you can see a little bit clearer what's happening. Not an optimum control strategy. When they get home, they put the air conditioner on, and then when it gets down to 25 degrees, they turn it off, and then when it gets too hot, they turn it on again, and so on. It would be better, it would be better to run the unit at lower power more constantly, and then have a more stable indoor air temperature. But the reports from the client is very positive. They're very comfortable, and they've not had any problem in any kind of under any heat wave condition, and really low energy bills and good comfort. They use the system very little. Good shading devices, lots of the passive cooling strategies that we talked about earlier have been implemented here as well. So that's a kind of summary of the active systems that we've worked with, and some of the conclusions. Of course, there's a real issue here with refrigerant gases, and their global warming potential. This graph is quite telling. Beware of the logarithmic scale on the left there, but this is a global warming potential of different refrigerants. And, progressively, the really, really bad ones are being phased out in the market, and R32 is coming in, and so on. But of course, then we've got propane, we've got ammonia used a lot in industrial, refrigeration, supermarkets, and so on. And then CO2, which is increasingly common. CO2, of course, has a global warming potential of 1. Manufacturers are gradually moving towards these low impact refrigerants, but it's important to take that into account, because these refrigerants being released into the atmosphere obviously is a major problem, and it will be a major problem in lots of parts of the world that are going to be buying air conditioners in the next decade. So some conclusions: keep it simple. I think that's the lesson that we learn all the time. Exhaust all of the passive cooling strategies before you look at active cooling systems. Don't just go, oh, we need an air conditioner, so it doesn't really matter what we do with the thermal envelope. Of course, we need to bring them all together and keep the air conditioning units as small as possible. Warm and humid climates. We've sometimes used equipment that's not really made and road tested for humid climates, and it just causes a lot of headaches. So good to use equipment that's really made for the job and made for those kind of climates. Make sure that occupants are aware of the operation and limitations of their system when the handover happens. Make sure they're informed. Don't have any expectations that are completely unrealistic. To be honest, my conclusion is leave ventilation for ventilation. Incorporating heating and cooling batteries into the ventilation system can work, and it can be useful, in the summer, in the spring and the autumn months, but don't rely on that for your main cooling and dehumidification or heating. Rely on it for ventilation, and think about the heating, cooling, and ventilation, air conditioning with an active system separate to that. Conventional recirculation systems, fan coils or splits, we've just found to be the most robust. It's not the most innovative and exciting conclusion, but I think that's just the reality, and they're also the ones that have been able to deal with heat waves. They've got enough power. And the low cooling loads in passive houses, like I mentioned earlier, means that you can generally run them at lower flow rates. That means they're more quiet, they're more comfortable, they're more efficient. And they won't be used very much. That's a reality, certainly in comparison to a conventional building. Split systems, direct expansion with refrigerant distribution, offer better dehumidification power. They have a faster response usually than a water distribution system. Lower auxiliary electrical power consumption. There's less pumps. You just got the compressor and the expansion valve. You haven't got pumps circulating water. But important to look at the global warming potential of the refrigerants, because they are going to be manipulated on site, and they also can overcool. Split systems and VRF, variable refrigerant flow systems, can also sometimes overcool or over dehumidify. And if we are using direct expansion systems, there's increasingly more solutions on the market to incorporate heat recovery to preheat domestic hot water. So instead of taking heat out of the building and throw it into the street, which is then exacerbating the urban heat island effect if we're in a city, we can actually take that heat and condense it to water, which can help preheat domestic hot water. So that's a good, interesting option to think about, so that we don't, make the most of all of these things and don't overheat even more the air outside in the street. So there's a lot of people that helped, clients, colleagues who helped get this data together, and they are all here, and I thank them for that. And here is my data if anyone would like to get in touch, and really look forward to a bit of debate and question time, which is always the most interesting. And I think because you in the US, obviously so many varied climates, but I think you probably have the greatest experience in active cooling and dehumidification probably than any other part of the world. So it's been a pleasure to be here with you. I hope you've enjoyed it, and above all, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.